Welcome back to the shop. I'm Kirk Anderson. In this week's video, I'll be making a jig to cut long mortises with a router. Now, a few weeks ago, I made a TV stand that had some long mortises that I cut with the router. And I really didn't demonstrate how I made the jig, and some people have commented that they would love to see how I did that. Now, the first thing I did was cut the strips on the table saw. Now, this jig is basically designed for a one-time project. It's not a jig that you can use over and over again. So the best material to use in a jig like this is some scraps. And I just happen to have some 1/2-inch Baltic birch scrap from a previous project. Now you can use any type of wood, but plywood is probably the best for this type of a jig. Then I pulled out my small cross-cutting sled to cut pieces off of these strips, and these small pieces will be stop blocks on the jig. Now in making this jig, I'm putting the workpiece on a stack of blocks. And the reason for this is to get it elevated so I can get clamps underneath it. Now the first thing I do is I take one of the strips and I'm going to glue it to the main part of the jig. Now I want this strip to be at a total perfect 90-degree angle to the main part of the jig. So I use a square to ensure that. Now I will be attaching the two pieces with glue and brad nails. Now again, I make sure that it's at a perfect 90-degree angle, and then I will temporarily clamp it and put in one brad nail, and then I'll check it again to make sure it's perfectly aligned, and then I'll put in more brad nails. Now the strip on the other side, I still want it to be pretty even, but it doesn't have to be as precise. And this strip again will be attached with glue and brad nails. Now what I also did here, I put a folded up piece of paper between the workpiece and the strip. And that's to put a little bit of a gap there, so it will be easy to take the jig on and off. Now it might be hard to tell, but you can see that there's a larger gap on the front end than on the rear end of the jig. But on this end, that's not an issue, as the jig will be set up and aligned on the other end that we made sure was a perfect 90 degrees. Now it's time to start marking where the mortise will be. Now I want the mortise to actually start about 1/2 inch in. Now we need to put the stop blocks in that we cut earlier. And the first thing we need to do is measure from the center of the router bit to the edge of the router base. Now I'm going to glue these blocks in using CA glue. And again, I used the square to make sure that they're perfectly lined up. Now you might have noticed that I measured to the flat part of the base for putting in the stop blocks. That's because I'm going to use the flat parts of the base to start and end. I don't want to run the flat part of the base up against the jig. The reasoning for this is if you use the rounded part of the base up against the jig, if you tilt it either forward or back, the router bit is still going to stay in the same location. If you were to put the flat part of the base up against the jig, and by chance you were to tilt it, it would pull the router bit out from the path that you want to make. Now it's time to make the cut. One of the drawbacks about doing a mortise like this is the mortise is the size of whatever bit you're using. And it was a successful straight cut, no issues whatsoever. Now I set up my dado blade in the table saw to cut the tenons. Now in any mortise or tenon joint, it is always easier to cut the mortises and then cut the tenons to fit the mortise, rather than the other way around. Now since I cut the mortise about a 1/2 inch in from the end of the piece, I need to cut off about a 1/2 inch of the tenon. And the easiest way to do this is with a hand saw, and I'm using a Japanese pull saw. Now once I cut the ends off, I also did round over the tenons with just some sandpaper. And the reason is, using a router bit doesn't produce square corners. Now it's time to join the pieces. And as with most mortar and tenon joints, it's just going to be secured with glue and clamped in. I put a good amount of glue into the mortise, make sure I get some glue up on the sides, and then I put a little bit of glue on the tenon, and then just slide it in and clamp it down. And once the glue cures, it is almost impossible to take that apart. Well, that does it for this project. Making a jig to cut mortises with a router is actually pretty simple. Now you can redesign it so it could be used on many different sizes of projects, but this particular one, like I said, is project specific. So unless you're going to make another project that's the exact same dimensions, this is a one-time jig. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, give it a like, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. And as always, all you woodworkers out there, just get out there and cut some wood.